Welcome back to We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling, where I give you the tools and skills you need to love better so you can live better. Have you ever heard of the term lesbian bed death? It refers to an assumption that lesbian couples in long-term relationships have less sex than other couples, or that they stop having sex altogether. The term is misleading because the truth is most couples in long-term relationships see a dip in the amount of sex they have over time. Having less sex is not a lesbian thing. It's actually a long-term relationship thing. Desire in long-term relationships is complex. Life today is a lot, and it does get in the way. For a lot of women, desire isn't something that is always accessible or on demand. It's something that ebbs and flows, and it's influenced by everything from stress and exhaustion to how emotionally connected they feel to their partner. And yet we live in a culture that is constantly telling us that good sex is supposed to be spontaneous and fiery and frequent, which can lead us to feel like something is broken when we hit a dry spell. But what if we've been sold a myth? What if the way we think about desire is actually part of what makes it so hard to sustain? Today, we're talking to Dr. Lori Brotto, who has spent years researching the science of desire, breaking down myths, and offering women in particular practical, evidence-based tools to reconnect with their sexuality. She believes that desire isn't just something that happens to us. It's something that we can cultivate, something we can be mindful of, and something that we can actually reimagine in ways that work for our lives and our relationships. So if you've ever found yourself wondering why desire can feel so fleeting, or if you're looking for ways to rekindle intimacy in ways that feel authentic, today's episode is for you. So let's get into it with Dr. Lori Brotto. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation. And I think where I'd like to start is by clarifying, is there a difference between women's sexual desire and men's sexual desire? And if so, what are those differences?
Yeah, it's a great question to start with. And it's not going to be an easy answer because the answer is it depends on how you ask and what you're measuring. So as an example, when the big population-based scientific studies measure low desire and provide a very narrow definition of low desire, which is usually along the lines of, have you had a reduced interest or motivation in sex? Those big studies find that women have, that is far more prevalent in women than in men. So about 30% of women will say 3 months or more over the last year, they've had low desire, and about half that prevalence of men do. Now, when you look at within experimental studies, when you bring women, say, into a controlled laboratory research environment, you show them an erotic film, and then you ask them afterwards, did that arousal trigger desire for you or a motivation for sex? There's actually no difference at all, right? So where there probably is a difference is in the kind of spontaneous thinking about sex, motivation for sex, but in a very controlled environment, when a person is already aroused, there's probably no gender differences in desire, the desire to have sex in response to being aroused.
That makes so much sense to me. And again, this is not my lane, so I'm just going to stick my neck out and ask, is it because like the in this experiment that you just described, the women and the men, all the subjects, by watching the erotic film, it's essentially acting as foreplay, no?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yes, if you imagine what's happening in real life, and let's just imagine that this is a heterosexual couple, the female partner in that heterosexual couple, especially if there's difficulties with desire, is far more likely to say, there's not enough foreplay, we get right to sex before I'm aroused and excited, and the experience is kind of lackluster, I don't have a lot of sexual satisfaction, etc. In contrast to the situation where she has had time to become aroused through the various means that are arousing for her, then her desire is going to be much higher. So definitely in the controlled laboratory environment where we can, have her in privacy, she's watching a very exciting sexual film, she's probably going to have much higher level of arousal than, say, she would at home.
So when we're comparing women's desire to men's desire, when we see the dip, what is the explanation for that dip?
Yeah, there's again, great question. And there's been a lot of scientific studies that have looked at this. And the conclusion is it's probably a mix of psychological, interpersonal, as well as biological. So, on the biological side, we know that the hormone testosterone is correlated with levels of sexual desire because folks who are assigned male at birth have 10 times the level of testosterone circulating in their bloodstream than those who are assigned female at birth. And that those levels don't really start to dip to any clinically meaningful level until males are in their 50s. So that
Mm,
means they have that much stronger physiological push towards sexual desire than females do. So that's part of it. There's also kind of a gendered explanation in that the role of distractions and negative mood and anxiety and other factors like that that are more psychological or context dependent probably interfere more in women's desire than they do in men's desire. And you can probably think of lots of colloquial examples of that where, a woman might be more likely to say, I can't have sex until things are just right, right? The dishes
right.
are cleaned and the kids' permission forms are signed and I've double checked the front door and it's locked. And for males, those interfere far less.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that women have about their own sexual desire, especially in long-term relationships?
Yeah, there are quite a few misconceptions and myths. I think a really important one that deserves debunking right out of the gate is that once you lose desire, you can't get it back. And we can think of examples where that is certainly not the case. So you think of the older woman who maybe is in a brand new relationship, maybe she's separated from a partner, her partner's passed away, and she's in a brand new relationship, and she will describe very high levels of sexual motivation and desire
Mhm.
say to someone in their 20s or who's in a brand new relationship. So the idea that desire that once you lose it, it's gone, or that desire is necessarily age related. Actually, there's not a lot of scientific evidence for that at all. So that means that if you are someone who has experienced a decline in desire, part of what we do as clinicians is figure out, well, what are the elicitors that we need to put back in place? Is it more novelty? Is it making sure that that person has the right stimulation so that arousal can trigger desire for them? Or is it as simple, maybe not so simple, as eliminating the distractions, whether they're negative judgments or just benign everyday distractions that pull our attention out of the present moment?
So I can just imagine again that because men have 10 times the amount of the hormone testosterone in them as women do, that that becomes a fuel source for motivation for sex in them. And I can imagine, please correct me if I'm wrong, that they would, as all of us, see the world through our own lens. So it's a little incomprehensible to a lot of them that we women would require the amount of time and warming up and stimulation and foreplay that we do require, and that may play a role in why women's desire tends to ebb,
Mhm.
particularly in longer term relationships, because that's part of the choreography that tends to get skipped over when we're in a longer term relationship. Please, that was a question. It was phrased as a statement, but it is
Yeah.
there's an imaginary question mark at the end of that.
Yeah, it was beautifully phrased, and I think you're absolutely right, is that we can only sort of base our experience on our own personal perspective. And this is why, for a person who has low desire, my own view as a clinician is that it is always best addressed in the context of a couple. If that person is in a relationship where the other person can understand what are the elicitors of her, let's say her in this case, her desire, and how maybe she is someone who only experiences desire after she's been aroused and turned on. And the number of times that I've seen, sort of deer in headlights eyes by the partner who says, what do you mean you don't get turned on out of the blue? What do you mean you don't spontaneously think about sex? Don't you have that urging, that carnal craving inside you? And let's just say she's the one who with the quote, I self-identified low desire in this case, she'll say, no, I don't. I'm perfectly fine living my life even without sex. It's much more intentional. It's planned. I think about what's in it for me. I think about what's in it for us. And so ensuring that, especially if that person's in a relationship, ensuring that the other person can kind of empathize and, if not understand, at least hear the way that person experiences their desire. That's kind of a necessary first step for anyone who's really struggling with low desire in a relationship.
You said something that blew my mind a few minutes ago in this answer. So interesting. And it almost sounded to me like you were saying that for men, the desire and then the motivation to have sex happen at the same time,
Yeah.
and that it's incomprehensible to them, that it doesn't work that way with us.
Yes. Yeah. So exactly. So what we're talking about right now is responsive desire. It's the observation. Again, lots and lots of research has shown this, that especially for women more so than men, and especially for people in longer term relationships compared to shorter term, that it can be entirely normal and common to not have sexual desire at the outset of a sexual encounter. That the desire emerges after the person has become aroused and excited. So for men, and especially for men in shorter term relationships, it's usually the opposite way. You're horny first, you're in the mood first, and then you seek out stimulation, you seek out a partner, you make the advance, and then the arousal happens after that. So it's such an important concept to describe when there's a discrepancy in people's levels of desire in a relationship, because sometimes it can just be as simple as that. Oh, you mean your desire happens after arousal and your desire happens before arousal? Okay, we can work with that. How do we make sure everyone in the room has both desire and arousal happening? What do we need to put in place?
My brain literally exploded a little bit when you said that, because I was like, wait, am I tracking this right? Those two things happen at the same time for men. And I, as a woman, certainly know that they don't happen simultaneously for women. And do we blame the media for this? For like the 10-second foreplay at the most that movies depict women needing foreplay for before they can have sex? Like, what do we blame this? I mean, certainly it's perpetuated by media and the way we see sex portrayed, no?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's perpetuated by that. And it is certainly influenced by the national inadequate levels of sex education that currently happen in your country, but also in my country. We know that, that the current kind of status of sex education teaching to young people is largely focused on sexually transmitted infection prevention. It is rare that we talk about normative models of sexual response and what is desire, what is arousal, and what is an orgasm. I mean, I still have lots of women and people in my own practice who are in their 30s, 40s and beyond that say, I still don't know what an orgasm is. So yeah, it's this combination of the kind of media portrayal of the automaticity of desire. You don't see foreplay. You see people reaching orgasm through intercourse, which, by the way, 80% of people with vaginas don't reach orgasm through vaginal penetration. Let's just debunk that myth out of the park.
Newsflash.
So it's that, pornography has an influence. And I think pornography, erotica definitely have their place. They can be great tools for teaching a person how to feel arousal, but as an instructional agent for teaching people, especially young people, what real normal sex looks like, is actually, it's quite damaging, especially in the absence of comprehensive sex education.
It's so true. Now that's the third thing that goes on my list of like the most important skills that were never taught as kids going through the public school system. I think emotional management skills, relationship skills, and we don't teach kids about their bodies. We don't teach kids that it's not normal to have sex simultaneously through intercourse. And most women will not have orgasms through intercourse by and large. We
That's
don't
right.
teach any of these things.
When you pair that with porn being the teacher,
Correct.
It's no wonder that we still have, to this day, so many people walking around feeling broken or feeling like everyone else is having great sex and knows how to get aroused and is having easy orgasms except me. And so, there's lots of calls to action in that. I mean, I firmly believe that age appropriate and developmental sex education, starting at the youngest age possible and layering on top of that over the
Yeah,
years, including a discussion of pleasure and what pleasure is just essential for living well.
I concur with that. How do you explain to women that desire isn't something that just happens? And what steps can women take to start cultivating it with intention?
Because I'm both a researcher and a clinician, I often will rely on, like, what does the science say? And first of all, that surprises people that there's an entire scientific study of sexuality where we measure things like, how frequently do people have sex? What contributes to satisfying sex? Why does having healthy sexual satisfaction matter for your overall quality of life? So I rely on that quite a bit. And I very frequently share data that shows that, yeah, for a lot of women, especially those in longer term relationships, they don't have this spontaneous desire that maybe they had
Mm-hmm.
at a younger age, or maybe they had in that same relationship at the very beginning of the relationship. So I definitely use words like normative, common, you're not broken. And then I will often actually draw out the sexual response cycle. And because then it really empowers people to think about, okay, well, if I'm not having sex because of desire at the outset, why have sex? Why bother? And that's actually it's an important question. It's
I
a
think it's
common
I
question.
think it's a very fair question to ask. It particularly, and I don't know how much research you've done on lesbian or same-sex relationships, but particularly in the lesbian community, those two things do not happen at the same time, and it often leads to, have you heard the term lesbian bed death, which really
Yes.
should just be called long-term relationship bed death.
Right. It's so true. It's not particular to lesbian women, that's for sure. Yeah, I
Because
think,
we think that because we don't feel the desire,
yeah,
but we want to be intimate with each other, it almost seems like we're putting the cart before the horse, when
yeah,
in reality, please go on. So
yeah,
what can we do to
yeah,
cultivate it?
yeah. So think about, like, be really intentional. And it may seem like a silly question, why have sex? But I know when I ask people that question, they sort of pause and they say, "Oh, that's a great question. I've never really thought about it." So then I'll sometimes provide them a list. There's been a lot of research that shows that, yes, there's an average of 237 distinct reasons that people provide for why they have sex. Not everyone, but in the big research studies that has shown that, you can probably distill that down to about 20 different reasons. So thinking about, is it to enhance emotional connection? Is it to
Mm,
celebrate a birthday? Is it because it helps you get to sleep? Is it because it's, revenge sex? Is it because you want to have pleasure on the other side? Or again, so being really intentional about what are you getting out of the sexual encounter for you, for the relationship. Maybe it's a gift to give to your partner, which is not a bad reason. However, we want to make sure that the reasons are positive reasons and that they're not to avoid something bad. So, what researchers call avoidance related reasons. So, things like, I'm having sex to avoid a fight. I'm having sex
right.
to avoid conflict in the home, and my partner is angry to me and the kids and what have you. So, those are not good reasons. In fact, that's a straight road to resentment in the long term.
Albeit very common.
Very common.
The number of times every month that I hear a female client tell me it was easier to just have the sex than to have the conversation
Yeah,
and have to sleep in separate ends of the bed. Like it
yeah,
was just easier. It was less energy to just have the sex, which,
that's right. Yeah,
is disappointing, but it's also
yeah.
very common.
Yeah, so we think about reasons first and foremost. And then, we do talk about context, like what's happening around you. Are you being distracted by worrying about whether kids are going to walk in, or is the dog kind of sleeping at the foot of the bed and distracting you? Are you worried about other things? Are you worried about getting pregnant? Are you over focused on getting pregnant? Are you worried about an STI? What are some of those kind of context related factors that are either going to
Hmm.
facilitate desire or inhibit it? And then the third really key part is, what are the actual things that you're doing to elicit a sexual response for you, and making sure that you and partner know what those things are. So that might sound so straightforward, but actually a lot of women have no idea what are the things that turn them on. Maybe they knew at one point in the past, but fast forward many years or many decades, and those same things might not work for them anymore. And so this is where, number one, knowing what turns you on, and number two, if you're in a relationship, being able to show or communicate that to a partner. So one of the things that there may be an overemphasis of is direct clitoral stimulation, right? We know that direct stimulation of the clitoris in a woman who's not aroused can actually be pretty painful.
Yes.
And unpleasant.
Yes.
So if partner is thinking, okay, I got the MO, no vaginal stimulation, just clitoral. But if that person is
But that's not step one.
It's not step one.
No.
Maybe step 4 or 5.
Yes.
Right. So again, that's gonna be an important piece as well, so that she feels aroused. So having the good reasons, the appropriate context, making sure the stimuli are appropriate for her. If those are all three in place, then that kind of opens up the pathway to feeling some arousal, some excitement in the body. And then if she focuses on that and is not distracted and is not pulled away, this then paves the way for sexual desire. So it's responsive desire in that it emerges in response to having arousal. So this would be kind of core educational information that I would share with someone who was seeking my help for low desire.
Which is essentially, you're not going to always feel desire, but it can be cultivated when you can figure out what it is that sex does for you. What need does it fulfill in you?
Yeah.
And also when you're able to communicate, well, register for yourself first what turns you on, and then be able to communicate it to your partner. And you're saying that the vast majority of women don't do this.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully your listeners are listening to this and having a bit of an aha moment for themselves, and maybe doing some things differently in their own sexual encounters as a result of learning this information.
What's really important to underscore here is that this is not rocket science. It's literally asking yourself, what need is sex fulfilling in me?
Right.
And yes, there are. What I heard you say is that there are some reasons that we don't want to go through the act of having sex for, particularly if it's to avoid something in the discomfort zone.
Yeah. So pain could be another discomfort, right? So let's say she has
like physical.
Yeah. Let's say she has vulvodynia, provoked vestibulodynia, diagnosed vulvar or vaginal pain condition. We wouldn't advocate that she continue on with, sex is not supposed to hurt. So if there's pain, number one, it has to be investigated for understanding what is the reason for the pain. And then secondly, we wouldn't suggest that she continue to do the things that elicit pain for her, because then over time, pleasure is going to become conflated with pain.
Because
and so even
fires together, wires together. And if you have pain during sex, eventually you become avoidant of it, because you've connected, you've linked the two things up.
Yeah.
And then that becomes another complication to overcome.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And for people with chronic vulvodynia or chronic provoked vestibulodynia, which is provoked pain through vaginal or vulvar touch, they might say they can even feel vulvar pain just by thinking about it. Like by anticipating sex, they feel it's not made up. It's not, all in quote, all in their head. But it tells us that the impact of kind of thoughts and catastrophizing in the brain has a direct impact on our physiology. And it does.
It's kind of like bracing before the wax, the first rip, and to be honest, it never hurts as much as I expect it to. Right. But I literally, sometimes I have to walk myself through that. I'm like, it never hurts as much as you think it's going to.
Right.
So let's just rip it off and it'll be fine.
Right.
But also don't be doing that over and over again to rehearse a negative association with sex.
Yeah.
We Need to Talk is sponsored by Mindful Care. You might remember my friend, Dr. Tamir Aldad, from a few episodes back. He just texted to let me know that Mindful Care is now accepting new patients. We all know how hard it is to find an in-network psychiatrist without a long wait list, but Mindful Care can see you same or next day for medication management, recovery, and group therapy. No wait. And they take Medicaid, Medicare, and commercial insurance. Visit mindfulcare.com or text or call 516-505 7200 to book your appointment today. Can you walk me through how stress, anxiety, or even just a very busy life can interfere with sexual desire?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. And I think it's important because, the big studies show that we, as a society, we are becoming more stressed. And, when we talk about stress, we're not talking about big traumatic events, although those are terrible and those can definitely impact your sexual response. What we're talking about is kind of the day-to-day, low-level chronic stressors that actually wreak more havoc on your brain than a single traumatic event. So the person who has the never-ending to-do list, the person who is constantly on the hamster wheel and multitasking and, working and caring for kids and volunteering, and you're supposed to work out and you're supposed to, have good friendships and you're supposed to find me time, and actually finds that incredibly stressful. So there's a number of ways that can impact sexual desire and sexual response. One is purely physiologically. So we know that a healthy stress response system is one in which we wake up in the morning with high levels of cortisol, which is the main stress hormone. And over the course of the day, those cortisol levels come down. So that's a normal, healthy stress response. In a person who's chronically stressed, they wake up with high cortisol and it stays high at the end of the day. So their body has not learned how to regulate to homeostasis and bring stress levels down. So that's one way. And we know that kind of flatlining of cortisol without it coming down is highly correlated with low desire, difficulties becoming aroused, et cetera. The other way that stress and anxiety can impact is much more psychologically. So if you imagine, if you're either multitasking, thinking about the to-do list, or you're worried, either worried about things in general or having worries about sex, it's going to take your brain out of the sexual encounter and essentially cut off that really important connection between the brain and the body. The brain's the biggest sex organ. So if the brain is preoccupied and is consumed with negative self-judgments or worries or catastrophic thoughts, it's going to shut down the sexual response. And no amount of stimulation of the body or stroking of the clitoris is going to restore that. So the brain and the body need to be in communication and in sync with one another in order for arousal to happen and in order for it to feel satisfying for people.
So, what is a person living in contemporary society to do when they have the normal amounts of stress, which are extraordinary today for
Yeah,
most people? What is
yeah,
the person to do to cultivate that mindfulness or that
yeah.
connection with when you just said, the brain is the largest sex organ in the body, that was a mic
Mhm.
drop moment.
Yeah, I mean, if I could make all of society better, I would say, we need to reduce levels of stress, but that's not a problem I'm going to solve anytime soon, nor do I see any shifts in that
Mhm.
direction. In fact, what we see is much higher levels of stress, even stress among young people and adolescents. So the question is, can you kind of let go of that multitasking during sex? And this is where you mentioned mindfulness, which has been kind of the mainstay of my own research for the past over 20 years, is mindfulness, which is the practice of present moment, non-judgmental awareness. And it's a skill that we practice. It's not just a decision we make, it literally is a skill that we practice, can be folded into sexual activity. So in our research program, what we've done this now with thousands of women and men and others and non-binary people, is you first teach them the skill of mindfulness in the non-sexual arena, right? So they learn kind of the patterns of the mind. They develop some skill with bringing the mind back to the present moment. They kind of have a bit of a sense or what's the range of distractions that are happening for them when they try and sit still. And then once they've developed some skill in present moment, non-judgmental awareness, you can start to gradually bring that into sexual encounters, maybe first during self-touch and masturbation, and then gradually building up to bringing those same skills into partnered sexual activity, where they've now got a concrete way of really staying present so that their brain is also having sex, not just their body is,
Yeah.
while their brain is somewhere else, but both their brain and their body are in the present, totally engaged in the sensations.
So are there two or three or even one tools that you could share with the listeners to help them begin to cultivate mindfulness in non-sexual activity that can then be brought into sexual activity so that we can learn how to bring our mind oriented to the present when we're starting to become overwhelmed
Yeah.
by lots of thoughts?
Yeah, great question. So what the data tells us is that that really the type of mindfulness practice, like what you're focusing on, is less important than the fact that you're doing it regularly, right? So if you think of a gym analogy, yes, there's different factions that go back and forth about weight training versus VO2
Mm-hmm.
max and et cetera. But really the important thing is to move your body. And we want to make sure that people are moving their body most days, right? And so the same thing we say with mindfulness is that we would advocate that on most days of the week that you carve out a few minutes, maybe 5 or 10 minutes every single day where you're doing a mindfulness practice. And maybe you're listening to a guide that's delivered through an app. Maybe you hop onto YouTube and you download a 10-minute guided mindfulness practice, and that you practice it every day. So some of those practices might invite you to focus on the breath or
Mm-hmm.
body sensations or sounds or even thoughts themselves or some gentle movements. But all of those translate into structural and functional changes in the brain. So our brain actually grows more dendrites and axons when we practice. And you
Yep.
also see different patterns of activation in the brain when you practice mindfulness. So that would be kind of a starting point, is develop a regular mindfulness practice every day.
Like 2 to 5 minutes a day, either breath work or guided meditation or,
Yeah.
any of the meditations. So like
Yeah.
even the most cotton candy meditations, better
Yeah.
than nothing, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And it's because when you think about it, what are we trying to cultivate? We're trying to cultivate an ability to be present, or if we can't be present, an ability to catch our mind when it takes off and bring it back into the present moment. So that's half of mindfulness, is that kind of attention training. But the other half is the compassion, right? It's the being kind to yourself. It's the ability to, when your mind takes off, to not say, oh, I'm terrible at this. I can't do this. I hate yoga. I'm incapable of paying attention. And rather you say, oh, there you go, mind, come back into the here and now. And my view is that the compassion training that we gain in mindfulness is so important for sexual health, where we are just riddled with judgments, right? We're broken. We're not good enough. My partner's going to leave me. My partner's comparing me to past partners. I'll never be able to have an orgasm. These really deep, negative, catastrophic judgments that, again, mindfulness is really important to help us get some control over.
You've mentioned the importance of feeling both emotionally connected with a partner for desire to flourish. So, how can couples work on building that emotional connection, especially when life gets in the way? We've talked a little bit about, how to cultivate mindfulness individually, when your clothes are on outside of the bedroom, outside of intimacy. Now, how can couples bring that emotional connection together, which I would imagine would be really, really important for women's sexual desire to flourish?
Yeah, especially for those women that don't feel any kind of physical signs of desire. And especially for the women who say, yeah, feeling emotionally connected to my partner is the necessary gateway in order for me to be receptive to my partner's advances. And also the necessary gateway for me to feel arousal and sort of continue on. So those women, in other words, who say, I can't have sex unless I'm
Mhm.
feeling emotionally connected to my partner. And there are some people who can't do it alone, that really need the assistance of a couples therapist like yourself, to be able to figure out what is standing in the way of emotional connection. What does emotional connection look like for them? And how can they start to implement things in their lives through exercises, through communication, through shared values, through things that they look forward to together to build that emotional connection. So the answer is that for some people who might be seeking sex therapy for low desire or discrepant desire, doing some couples therapy might be a necessary precursor for some of them.
And for those people whose issues are not that vast, not that significant, are there little things that people can do on a daily basis to foster an emotional connection so that particularly women who require that to feel desire can begin
Yeah.
to stoke that?
Yeah, of course. So I often say to people, what are the things that you used to do at the start of the relationship? And think back to those moments when you really felt, desired and important and validated. They might say, oh yeah, my partner used to, leave me love notes in my lunch bag, or they used to call me out of the blue, not for any reason other than to say I'm thinking about you, or the kind of going out of your way to pay me a compliment or something like that. So it's going to be different for every different person. But what happens over the long term in a relationship is we stop doing those things because we become more comfortable. And yet the research really tells us that and couples tell us this as well, that those are the things they miss the most. In fact, some of them miss those things even more than the
Then
sex
sex.
itself, right? It's the little nothings. It's the sweet nothings that they miss the most. So how can we start to put some of those back into our relationship?
It's seduction and dating, and we can't
Mhm.
stop that and expect to still feel desire, folks,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
if you stop dating, if you stop seducing, if you stop doing the things that you did in the beginning that made the person fall in love with you and feel desire for you, like
Mhm.
desire and love are not destinations, they're
Yeah,
daily practices.
yeah. Beautifully put. Beautifully put.
And if you
Beautifully
stop
put.
doing them, they're simply going to go away.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And I think what happens, I know what happens, is that in the beginning of a relationship, we're so filled with the neural chemicals that it feels effortless, but it's not effortless. Our
Mhm.
motivation is a little effortless because
Mhm.
we feel the desire to do all these
Yep.
things because all these good neural chemicals are
Yeah.
flooding our entire system.
Good
But
old
those
dopamine. Yeah.
right, but what that is fueling is the creative thinking. It's leading us towards finding those sweet nothings
Yeah.
to do for our partners that have a cumulative effect of making them both feel loved and love
Mhm.
us as well and
Yeah.
feel desired.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm glad that you pointed out that, they don't happen automatically. They're actually very intentional. It just feels easier because you're kind of riding the physiological rush that happens when things are new and you have the dopamine system kicked in. And so, yes, it does require more intention, more effort over time, but really it's the same things. It's the same things
Right.
that we're doing.
And when those neurochemicals dissipate, as they do in the second stage of relationships, as people build trust and security and attachment, what needs to happen at that point is you need to continue to do the same things that you were doing. Otherwise, it is going to simply just
Yeah,
dissipate.
you got it.
Many women feel pressure to be spontaneous because that's what we're taught, or adventurous
Mhm.
because we're also taught that that's important in the bedroom. But what if that doesn't come naturally to
Mhm.
someone? What is someone who is less naturally inclined to be a wild
Mhm.
child in the bedroom?
Mhm.
What is someone to do if that's not natural for them?
Yeah, so let's tackle, the myth of spontaneity, and to which I would say, what else do you do in your life that's important and of meaning that is totally spontaneous? Very, very little. Most of the things that bring us a lot of joy are planned, right? You plan dinner parties, you plan events, you plan travel, et cetera, all of which by planning, you kind of carve out emotional energy and time to think about, you think through details, you get ready, you make a myriad different adjustments in your life in order to plan for that. So why are we not doing the same thing when it comes to sex? That we sort of ride this expectation that it's going to just happen. And again, it's probably largely fueled by what we see in the media. You never see people putting it on their calendar or having a conversation in the morning about what they need to do in the day in order to kind of clear their schedules for the evening. So I think that's a really important myth to debunk. And we want to encourage people to be very intentional about planning sex because then you can imagine it, you can fantasize about it. So to answer your second question, which is, what about the person who might have some inhibitions or not quite sure what to do, et cetera? Well, fantasy can guide you there, right? So if you plan sex and it's happening many hours later, you can start to imagine in your own mind what you might do. What are the things you want to try? What are the things you're looking forward to? And then bring that with you so that we kind of have this extended foreplay.
Yeah.
I often say to couples, foreplay should start when your sexual encounter ends. It starts then and it goes all the way through to the next planned sexual encounter. So maybe that's
I love that.
many days there where this kind of extended foreplay is happening. And then, you use your imagination and see where it takes you.
So then I'm guessing you're a proponent of scheduled sex.
I sure am. As a card-carrying busy person, I sure am.
And you don't feel that that diminishes some of the excitement? It does just the opposite.
It does the
doesn't create
opposite.
it doesn't create pressure.
Mm-mm. No, no. Yeah, and we need to make sure that by scheduling that it doesn't backfire and that the person, especially if a person is maybe worried about sex or has fear of pain or has other difficulties that arise, that this then doesn't become kind of a protracted period of worry about the sex. So that we need to, be aware of and be careful with. For those folks, I would say, don't plan, just, if you're feeling in the mood, go for it. But for the vast majority of people, planning it does not make it clinical or boring or dry, because they can imagine, they can anticipate, they can fantasize, they can do whatever they need to do to ensure that they're well rested, that the distractors are removed from the environment, that, they've been able to do the sweet nothings or leave the love notes or whatever it is that's going to cultivate more arousal for them in the interim. So yeah, no evidence whatsoever that planning results in less enjoyable sex. If anything, it's the opposite.
Do the different sexes respond differently to calendaring sex?
Yeah, there's a bit of a gendered phenomenon here. And again, I think it's in part also because, people who are assigned male at birth, they do have that higher level of testosterone. So there is more of that physiological push that's there, that they don't rely on the planning as much as females do. So, but when I describe it in this way to a heterosexual couple who might be sitting in front of me, and talk about things like fantasy and imagining and role play and, extended kindling of the oven and whatnot, then they both get on board. They're very much behind the idea.
That's great to hear. And I think it's important information for people to to have this takeaway that, like, literally planning
Mhm.
sex, it's not going to undermine or sabotage the experience itself. If anything, what the research shows, unless you associate it with stress.
Right.
So you kind of have to do your own little experiment of
Yeah.
scheduling it and then see how you're feeling as you're getting up
Yeah.
to the point,
Yeah.
and then see how the experience was for you. And if you
Yeah.
found it to be awful, obviously don't rinse and repeat that. But if
Yeah.
you found it to be helping you to have this future orientation where you can, like, savor the
Mhm.
fantasy in the
Mhm.
days that leading up to it,
Mhm.
it can be
Mhm.
really, really beneficial.
Yeah. Well put. Exactly. It's exactly right.
When someone hits a dry spell in the relationship, it is so easy to think that something is wrong. What
Mhm.
would you tell someone who is feeling frustrated by their own diminished desire?
So communication is really important. So assuming that this person is in a relationship, again, when we look at what the literature tells us, the couples who tend to be the most sexually satisfied in the long term, we're looking in their 70s, 80s, and beyond. It's not the frequency of their sex; it's the quality of their sex communication. So those couples who can talk about changing preferences over time, the couples who can say, I've just had surgery. I think we need to put this on the shelf for the next 6 months and revisit it in 6 months' time. So those couples who can talk about it, are not afraid to talk about it, and welcome a partner's feedback, those are the couples that tend to be the most sexually satisfying in the long term. So if you are a person who is feeling like you're in a bit of a dry spell, have a conversation. Say, partner, honey, can we talk about something that's really important to me? You can reference listening to this conversation, or maybe you read something in the paper, and recognizing that sexual health is a core part of quality of life. It's not anything to be embarrassed about. In the same way that we do general health checks, we should do sexual health checks as well. And make sure that you don't talk about it in the bedroom or during sex. So you want to, again, schedule and prioritize this as an important conversation that you can have, where there's no judgments, there's no kind of expectations. It's just kind of having an open conversation with the other person. So I always say that's a good place to start, is have a talk about it.
Have a talk about it, and then how would you suggest the partner respond to that?
Mhm.
Because I can just imagine a myriad of responses that
Yeah,
could potentially turn that well-meaning conversation
yeah,
into a disaster. So how would you encourage the partner to
yeah.
respond when they're on the receiving end of hearing that their partner is not feeling desire?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So we need to be careful we're not using blame language, right? And one way to do that is we use I language. So I've been feeling like my desire has been down, et cetera. So that's a really important thing to kind of lessen the chance for the other person to have a bit of a reactive knee-jerk response to you. The other thing is, for the partner listening is try not to personalize this. So when let's say she in this situation says, "Oh, my desire's been down," watch the tendency to automatically think the worst. You're not attracted to me. Are you leaving? Are you cheating on me?
Mhm.
Right? Watch the tendency to jump to those really kind of catastrophic interpretations of what's going on and rather just listen. So ask questions that seek to understand. You don't have to try and problem solve it. So you can just kind of create a nice big container where no matter what the person says, you're here to just listen and try and understand. And I think doing that alone would go a very, very long way towards that couple then deciding, okay, what are the next steps after this?
When people fall out of desire with each other, is there generally a root of emotional disconnect?
No, not at all. So this is discrepant desire that is, we don't have a ton of research on, but increasingly people are starting to understand that when a person says they have low desire, that it's all relative to their partner's level of desire. So we become much more
Mhm.
interested in what we call discrepant desire and what are the contributors to discrepant desire. How do we know that the other person doesn't have abnormally high desire, right?
Right.
Right? Maybe their desire is normal, but the partner's level of desire is far too high. And it's not necessarily the case that emotional disconnect is the main reason for that. There can be many, many different reasons, just like there can be many different reasons for an individual person's low level of desire.
That's so interesting. Because I totally would have thought that it was the root of it was in an emotional disconnect. So if what you're saying is true, then would it benefit us early on in relationships to ask the person that we're contemplating entering a relationship with, like going back to the top of this discussion, what does sex do for you?
Yeah.
And what is your historical frequency of sex?
Yeah, yeah, and what are you into? I know my gay male friends will say, "Oh, you heterosexual women get it all wrong. The first thing you need to do is ask, what are you into? What are your likes and dislikes?" And sort of have that conversation within the context of consent right at the outset. And I think, wow, I mean, the number of sex therapy consultations that could be solved just from that, just from having the conversation. What are the things that turn you on? What are the things you want to stay away? What are the things you're afraid of when it comes to sex? Tell me a little bit about your most enjoyable sexual encounters in the past and what made them most enjoyable for you. You
Much
can,
easier questions to ask early on when you
yeah,
when the historical context doesn't involve you so much, so that if
yeah,
you're not the answer,
yeah.
if the person doesn't turn to you and say, "Oh, it was last Saturday night with you,"
Right,
it
exactly.
doesn't sting as much.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So again, it kind of comes back to our conversation earlier around if we had sex education as young people that really framed sex as in an empowering way and not something that we only need to think of in the context of sexually transmitted infections or pregnancy prevention, both of which are really important, but that those are just two parts of sexual activity that there's no discussion of pleasure within that. So, yeah, much more education, much more communication, and as early as possible.
I love that. Dr. Lori Brotto, where can people learn more about you?
You can find me on social media at Dr. Lori Brotto. My website is loribrotto.com, where I have a number of guided mindfulness meditations, and my books, Better Sex Through Mindfulness and the Better Sex Through Mindfulness workbook.
I love that. Thank you so much for your time today. This conversation was so, so great.
I agree. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling is a Sterling Standard production. Editing and sound engineering is by Bart Migal. Our theme music is by Trending Music. Special thanks to Amanda Christiani and Preston Smith. We'll be back on Tuesday with another episode packed with the dating, relationship, and mental health hacks you have come to expect. We'll see you soon.